Democratic lawmakers are calling for special counsel Robert Mueller to testify after the Washington Post broke the news last night on communications between him and Attorney General William Barr.
The Washington Post started with the headline, and then, of course, the big takeaway that Mueller had been disappointed, but then Michael Schmidt and the New York Times dropped the story just a few minutes later, Mika, where they told us and gave us contents to the letter about Mueller complaining that Barr's 4-page memo that was drafted in the span of 48 hours was twisting the public's perceptions of the findings.
Yeah, according to a copy of that letter reviewed by the Washington Post, Mueller said, quote, "The summary letter that the department sent to Congress and released to the public late in the afternoon on March 24th. You remember that was a Sunday afternoon. It was big breaking news. That letter did not fully capture the context, nature, and substance of this office's work and conclusions. There's now public confusion about critical aspects of the results of our investigation. This threatens to undermine a central purpose for which the department appointed the special counsel, to assure full public confidence in the outcome of the investigations." Justice Department officials told the Post that the letter made a key request, that Barr release the 448-page report's introductions and executive summaries, and made some initial suggested redactions for doing so. Mueller wrote that the redaction process need not delay release of the enclosed materials. Release at this time would alleviate the misunderstandings that have arisen and would answer congressional and public questions about the nature and outcome of our investigation. Mueller's letter was sent on March 27th. The same week as Barr's summary. And a day after the letter was sent, Barr and Mueller spoke by phone for 15 minutes, about 15 minutes, in which the Post reports Mueller expressed his concern.
Michael Schmidt, you wrote the story. You broke the news in the full extent of the story for the New York Times. Tell us about this and how it came about.
Well, what we're looking at here is a sentiment within the special counsel's office that bubbled all the way up to Mueller. There was widespread sort of frustration and disbelief at the way Barr characterized their findings. And I think folks in the special counsel's office understood the severity of the way Barr was doing this, and the way that it was casting the die on their findings, in the way that the public's consumption of this would be so important, and that they really wanted for their work to be looked at, and instead Barr had simply just put out the findings and not given the full picture. And there was deep frustration with this, to the point that Bob Mueller, who's really someone by the book, took the unusual step to send this letter to the Attorney General. And Bob Mueller has known the Attorney General for a long time, so it's not like he just called him up and said, hey, like, you know, I don't get this, I don't understand this. He memorialized it in a letter, setting off this subsequent conversation in which he sort of pushed Barr to put more information out, because at the time there was just Barr's letter, and the president had seized on it. That's the thing you have to understand. The president was saying that all of this exonerated him. And if you were in Mueller's shop and you looked at the president doing that, I could understand why that would bother you, because that's not really what they found.
Well, you know, Willie, it's very interesting. Many people have wondered why Robert Mueller didn't speak out earlier. He is a by-the-book guy. He's also a lawyer, and you learn very early as a lawyer, when you're practicing, you memorialize something in writing. It puts a time stamp on it. We all now know, because Robert Mueller put it in writing, put a time stamp on it, we know he misled the United States Senate. We know Barr lied to the House of Representatives. And we also know that he sat on that letter and held it from the American people to continue misleading the American people, knowing that Robert Mueller had said doing so would undermine the central purpose of the Justice Department's appointment of the special counsel.
And you don't have to take it for us. You can now take it from the special counsel himself, that the Attorney General of the United States was doing what we suspected he was doing, hoped he wasn't, that he was running interference for the President of the United States on the Mueller report. And Michael Schmidt, to be very clear about what we're talking about here and what Bob Mueller's complaint was and his problem was with Barr's 4-page summary and his presentation to the public, he was concerned about the question of obstruction of justice. It remained true that in Volume 1 that Bob Mueller said he could not establish a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, but he didn't like the way Bob Barr had summarized and presented Mueller's findings on obstruction of justice, where Barr effectively said, I couldn't find evidence to establish a charge of obstruction of justice. That's not what Mueller said in his report.
Yeah, see, the problem sort of stems from Mueller's decision not to make a decision. Mueller says that I'm not going to make a determination about whether the president broke the law. And that sort of left the door open for Barr to come in and to say, I don't think that he broke the law. Because if Mueller had said, yes, I think there's evidence the president broke the law, it would have put Barr in a more difficult position. Sure, he could have gone ahead and said, I don't think the president did break the law, but that would have been politically a more difficult position. But by Mueller not making a determination, sort of saying, hey, look, here are the facts about this, maybe a decision could be made on this after the president leaves office, it allowed Barr to sort of come in and seize the narrative and sort of outplay Mueller here. Barr comes in, is able to characterize the findings however he likes, and it allowed the president to go out. The other thing we have to understand here is that there are several weeks, I think at least a month, between the 4-page letter and when the report is released. And that allowed things to really set sort of in cement that there had been nothing wrong here, that the president had sort of been cleared of all wrongdoing. And I think regardless of whatever political party you come from, if you read the report, it's a much grayer document than the way it was sort of initially portrayed publicly. And if you worked on that investigation, I could see why you're frustrated.
You know, by the way, the Mueller report finally being released was bad political news for the President of the United States. He dropped 3-4 points, and the Morning Consult poll to his lowest position ever in that poll. This is going to be bad political news for the president as well, but don't take our word for it. Just know that the President of the United States is in a frantic tweet storm. He already 30 this morning, hoping, retweets, hoping, praying that people will be distracted once again by this old tactic. We will not. Instead, Benjamin Wittes, I want to ask you if what President Trump's Roy Cohn, as I call him, William Barr, whether he did in fact may have committed perjury in his answer to Charlie Crist, where Charlie Crist specifically asked him the question of whether there had been any frustration that the report had not been fully characterized, properly characterized in the Barr letter.
So, as you know, perjury is a sort of ridiculously technical statute, and it requires a very precise parsing of the exact question and the exact answer and all the possible things that that answer could convey. So I don't think we're realistically talking in that land at all. I think we are talking in a different land, which is, you know, would a reasonable member of Congress feel grossly misled by what the Attorney General said? And I think the answer to that is yes. And the Attorney General sitting on a letter that the special counsel had written expressing frustration with the way he had characterized it and the way that had spurred a media storm, asked a question about, you know, what can you tell us about frustration, kind of scratches his head and plays dumb. And I do think people are going to feel misled by that.
Well, misled also, it certainly, could that not be considered an abuse of power if you use your position to, quote, undermine the central purpose for which the Justice Department appointed the special counsel?
Look, Bill Barr has, I think, abused his position in a number of respects, and the most important of them is exactly the one that you just described, which is taking a document, and there is nothing technically inaccurate in Bill Barr's letter, but taking a document that is rich and complicated and conveys a great deal of information and characterizing it intentionally in such a way that an entire media ecosystem can go nuts for 2 weeks about how it is a simple vindication and clearing of the president, which it was quite obviously not. And I think the fact that we reacted that way at the time, you and I and 100 million other people, it is not surprising that internally within the Justice Department and the Special Counsel's office, Bob Mueller, who knew that report intimately because he wrote it, reacted quite similarly.
Well, it's so funny to listen to pathetic Trump apologists trying to blame this on the media, as a lot of them did last night, when, of course, it was the President of the United States that was jumping up and down, screaming the loudest with the largest megaphone, using Attorney General Barr's letter to misrepresent the contents of the report, which of course the media would then have to pick up on that as well. But Mike,
and Barr himself, used his own letter to mischaracterize the report, because in his press conference the morning of the report's release, he adopted a series of lines about the report that were directly tailored to the way the president was talking about it. He used the phrase "no collusion" multiple times. And so it's not simply that the president was mischaracterizing or was using his characterization to misdescribe what was in this complicated document. He himself, on more than one occasion, was again, without saying anything that was technically inaccurate, grossly mischaracterizing the document.
Mike Barnicle grossly mischaracterized the document. To borrow a phrase from former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, wretched Mueller's words from their proper context. After that, held a highly misleading and politicized press conference. After that, testified before the Senate and the House, grossly misled United States senators, and outright lied to Charlie Crist and the House of Representatives.
Yeah, Joe,
that, under any circumstance, is an abuse of power. And all the king's horses and all the king's men and all the hacks on the right, on the new Trump right, can't put that mess back together. Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and he pushed himself off the wall himself, and his reputation lies in 1,000 pieces. He abused his official power.
Yeah, Joe, and in this case, Humpty Dumpty had a partner in crime, it appears, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. And Michael Schmidt, I would like to ask you the following question. It appears from your reporting and from the Washington Post reporting that the sitting Attorney General of the United States, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, have at a minimum twisted the truth about a critical report worked on for 2 years by Bob Mueller and several other people who worked for Bob Mueller. And now, Bob Mueller, having laid out 10 separate instances of potential obstruction of justice, the sitting Attorney General of the United States said what he said. So the bottom line here is the Justice Department, again, from your reporting, indicates that they were somewhat miffed, angered, frustrated by Bob Mueller's letter. What would possibly frustrate them about the truth?
Well, I mean, here's the fundamental problem. A special counsel was appointed to protect the investigation from the appearance of politics and from politics seeping into their work. And here we are 2 years after that happened, and the entire decision has been exposed to politics. Part of that is based on the fact that Mueller decided not to make a decision about whether the president broke the law. He sort of said that someone could make that call after the president leaves office. That allowed Barr to come in and make the decision and expose the final product to the winds of politics. And as we look at that now, this thing that everyone talked about for the past 2 years about how, Mueller was there to protect her and everything, the result of it is looked at completely in a political context. And that was not the goal from the beginning. That is not why you have a special counsel. You have a special counsel to try and prevent this from happening. And now we're going to spend the next 2 years talking about how the president's political appointees were the ones that made the ultimate decision about whether the president was charged. And that's just not how the system was supposed to work.
But, Mike, to follow up on what you said about Rod Rosenstein, this is a guy who blasted critics of Bob Barr's letter and said that it was bizarre. Said it was bizarre that anyone would even question whether the letter was misleading. Rod Rosenstein, the guy who acted weaselly when Donald Trump ordered him to write a letter justifying Comey's firing, and then broke down in tears after the media started attacking him. That Rod Rosenstein, he knew that the special counsel, he knew that Robert Mueller had said the very things that he was telling the press and the public he thought were, quote, bizarre.
Joe, this all adds up to something I'm sure you and many other lawyers, when you were practicing law, as lawyers practice law every day in municipal courts around this country, this adds up to a common phrase heard over and over and over again, unfortunately: bag job.
Yeah.
It was a bag job. And Mika, the most shocking thing is, I can tell you, at least in Pensacola, Florida, you knew not to lie to other lawyers. You knew that when the truth was going to come out, you had to keep your reputation in check, or you'd never be trusted. Your word would never be trusted before a judge again. You would never be able to get a deal on the side with another lawyer on pleadings or on some other question. So you always had to be straight. It's unbelievable how stupid, and what Bush leaguers, Rod Rosenstein, and the Attorney General of the United States have turned out to be. They knew this was coming out.
Right.
Barr was holding Mueller's letter that he was lying about, and he held it in his drawer. He held it in a file for a month, and then went to the Hill and lied to the Senate and lied to the House.
So this is, I want to get to Heidi on exactly the opportunity for Republicans here and whether or not they're going to take it. But Joe, some people are texting me saying that, Joe, President Trump is tweeting like crazy right now. Can you tell your friend that we're not interested?
Hey, Donald.
We're not going to. You could tweet nudes.
Hey,
we don't care.
We used to
We're
be
not
friends,
looking. Not interested.
And listen, I'm
we're going to
sorry
stay focused.
It turned out the way it did.
On this story.
Can't be friends with a guy that wants to be an autocrat.
Stop.
But you can just stop tweeting.
Stop that.
Go eat a ham sandwich. Get some KFC in the morning. I've always found their variety pack, like right before breakfast, is fantastic. Eat your Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Yeah.
Get a Big Mac. Get an Egg McMuffin. Something. McDonald's makes great pancakes. Do that. We're not going to pay attention to your tweets. And now back to our regularly scheduled program.
So Attorney General Barr is scheduled to testify before the Republican-controlled Senate Judiciary Committee this morning. What's the opportunity for Republicans to ask the right questions? What kinds of questions might he face in light of all of this? And also then moving on to House oversight and other questions. This changes everything, doesn't it?
Of course. There's been a dispute, Mika, whether Barr would even show before the committee in the House. And now I think this completely changes that equation. If he refuses to show, you better believe that subpoena cannon is going to fire. Secondly, I'm being told by House Democratic leadership sources last night that the timeline for getting Mueller up there in the chair is also expedited. If they get Barr this week, hopefully they will get Mueller next week. And Joe, it's not just Charlie Crist who Barr may have lied to when he testified. Chris Van Hollen was also tweeting that he point blank asked Barr in his testimony whether Mueller agreed with his conclusions on obstruction. And the answer to that was yes, and then I don't know. Well, we now know that was when he was in possession of the letter, and of course he knew. So there are also increasing questions over whether to this day information is still being suppressed, because if you look in the Washington Post report, there seems to have been a dispute over the redaction. So Mueller was unhappy not only that his executive summary wasn't released, but also that there may have been a dispute over redactions. And as we know, with the precedent here over classified information being released to Congress, that was done in previous instances where you had these outside investigations, both with Ken Starr and with Watergate. We, the people, may not see that classified information, but it's pretty customary for it to go to Congress. So the questions are going to be much sharper. And Mika, to your point, yes, let's watch and see how many Republicans step up versus letting Democrats take the reins on this.
So, Michael Schmidt, you actually had this story written yesterday, and you guys were holding it just to get the final confirmation from the Justice Department. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were, look, this is something that we've been looking at and working on for some time. There's a lot of, obviously, interest in this, and there is it's a very fraught issue that we've had to spend a lot of time trying to unwrap, and it's not the easiest thing.
How long have you been working on this? How long did this process take for you? How long have you? Well, let me just ask you this way: how long have you known about the existence of this letter?
Well, I mean, look, we've known about the letter, for as long as we knew about the letter. This stuff takes a lot of time. We've been working on it for a while,
yeah.
And when we get it, we know what we know, we go. And sometimes we don't know what we have, and that's just part of the process, and that's okay. It's sometimes frustrating.
Yeah.
But it's okay.
Yeah.
All right, Michael Schmidt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
For your patience and reporting.
Incredible reporting.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, Senate Democrat Chris Murphy joins us, also Republican Congressman Tom Cole, plus the former director of the CIA, John Brennan, joins the conversation. We've got a lot to talk about with him. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.